We've got three choices on what to do about this North African situation. We can pay, we can do nothing, we can fight. We're not going to pay because that's, again, the American attitude toward this. We're not going to do nothing because there's a lot of political pressure, so we decide to fight. In 1801, we are helped because the Pasha of Tripoli declares war on us. So that's rather convenient, works out to our benefit. For a 3-year period of time, from 1802 to 1805, we have a blockade of Tripoli and several other harbors. This is our first overseas military action. The Navy was actually in pretty good shape at this point because if you remember, we've been fighting that sort of a war with France where they were grabbing our guys. So this is referred to as the quasi-war with France. So we're sort of at war with them, but not really. So the Navy was actually in much better shape than any other branch of service at that time. That's why we could pull this off. So that's another one of those things where one thing happens and it allows another thing to happen. Had we not had the quasi-war, we wouldn't have a Navy capable of going to Tripoli and engaging in this combat. It just wouldn't have been possible. So it's all well and good to say, well, this is what we did, but we wouldn't have been able to do it had that other thing not happened. So finally, we come to a deal, a peace treaty with Tripoli in June of 1805. And the Marine Corps, since we have a Marine here, the Marine Corps, one of their lines in their anthem is "to the shores of Tripoli," and that refers to the incident where they actually land troops at one point on the North African coast. The Halls of Montezuma we'll get to later, okay? But the shores of Tripoli is right here. So, but again, this is our first overseas military action. It's not going to be our last by any stretch of the imagination, unfortunately, but it's our first. And we come away successful, sort of. We don't end all piracy in North Africa. That does not happen.
You just remind me of a joke I heard about Marines.
I would suggest, sitting this close to a Marine, you don't make any Marine jokes.
You want to hear it?
I'll hear it.
How do you get a Marine to commit suicide? Throw sand at a brick wall to hit the beach.
I will say this, having been in the Army and been around the Army for years, all the Marine officers I met were top-notch. I cannot speak to the enlisted Marines because
All
I
the
wasn't in the
enlisted
Marine
men
Corps.
were top notch too.
So, what's that?
All the enlisted men were top notch too.
I didn't meet them, so I can't offer an honest opinion. I can't offer an honest opinion. I will say though, I was dealing with field grade officers, majors and above.
Yeah.
So I was told by a number of those Marine majors that, yeah, we get a lot of dumb lieutenants,
Yeah.
which, you know,
And he's even the
par
better.
for the course.
He's even better because he had a blood strike. So.
There you go. There you go. So that's our first overseas combat experience, and it's going to be the first or the last big thing until we get to this, the War of 1812. Okay, War of 1812 starts much the reason we have that quasi-war with France, which is they're stopping our ships at sea and yanking our sailors. In this case, they're not taking the cargo for the most part. They're taking the sailors. Why? They're engaged in a huge war against Napoleon. They're desperate for manpower. The Royal Navy, serving in the Royal Navy sucks. Conditions are horrible for everybody, even the officers, okay? Actually, just being on a sailing ship in general in that era sucks. I mean, if you've ever toured one of those historic boats, like the USS Constitution or one of those, you get a feel for how insanely claustrophobic those ships are. The food is horrendous. Living conditions are terrible. When you're at sea, there's always water on the ship, always. You're never completely dry. It's just a horrible, horrible existence. So they're desperate for manpower, and the Royal Navy recruited much the way the British Army recruited, which is we go into a bar, we try to actively get men to join, and of course no one's that stupid, so no one joins, and then we go, let's see, who's drunk? And those people join. Or if I'm really desperate, I just walk into a bar and go, you, and you. You just join the Royal Navy. Come with me.
You can't say no.
Nope. Because there's armed guys with them who are going to make sure you go.
So it's technically not conscription?
It's forced conscription.
Okay.
Let's call it that way. It's forced conscription. So here's what happens. They stop American ships at sea. They have all the sailors come up on the deck. And they say, what's your name and where were you born? And if they say you have a British accent, well, you're clearly lying. You weren't born in America. You're a Brit. Here's the trick, though. Okay, I always assumed, well, that's just BS. It's all a trick. I've learned more about linguistics in recent years. And see, here's the thing. The New England accent that we know now actually was a much more British-sounding accent in 1812. So it's very possible, but those guys from like New York, New Jersey, and up, when they spoke, they really did sound British to the British. Now, would the British have cared? No, they wouldn't have. But linguistically, I was reading an article by a linguist who said, yeah, there's a pretty good chance that during the Revolution and even in the early 19th century, people from like New Jersey upward, they all sounded English to an English ear, or British to an English ear. Okay, so they grab these guys and say, no, clearly you're not from New Jersey. You have a British accent. Come with us. Okay. So those guys get enlisted, and again, they're American citizens. They shouldn't have to go through that, etc. So the vote for this war is completely a regional thing. Okay. The North, which is involved in shipping and commerce, wants the war. The South, which bought a lot of things from the British, don't want the war. So it's a complete regional vote. The North votes for, South votes against, more Northern votes for, boom, we're at war. Then Congress, because Congress is Congress and they've always sucked. What's the next thing they do? They adjourn for the year without bothering to vote any money for the war. So they take the vote, they declare war, and they go, okay, motion to adjourn until next April? All in favor?
Favor.
Second?
So,
Second.
so Congress adjourned at the most inopportune time.
Yes.
It's always been.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay? So they declare war and then say, okay, we'll see you guys next April when we come back. Because again, we're used to Congress, even though we complain about how little they work compared to people who have real jobs. I'm not somebody who should complain about that because I don't have a real job. I'm a teacher. But compared to people who have real jobs, 9 to 5, sometimes having to come in on Saturdays, etc., they don't work much. Compared to how they used to work in the old days, this Congress, man, they're working hard. I mean, they might be working 30, 35 weeks a year. I mean, come on, These guys come in, it's a few months, okay? It's a few months. You don't be there in summer, you don't be there in winter, so there'll be a spring session sometimes and a fall session, and that's it, okay? Less than 6 months they're working. And so they leave. So we've just declared war on another nation, and we have no way to pay for the war, no way to organize an army, beef up the Navy, nothing. So once again, what's my point? Congress has always sucked, okay? Please do not ever fall into the trap to think there was a golden era of history for any country, for any organization, for anything. There never was, okay? Everybody is screwed up. Everybody's always been screwed up. The degrees of screwed up go up and down. We're more organized, we're less organized. So, there we go. Now, what army we have is weak because we had a whopping, 3 regiments at the high point. Jefferson had to actually knock that down. And James Madison, who succeeded him, didn't beef it back up. So it's a tiny army. The Navy, as I said, is in better condition. First because of the quasi-war with France, then because of fighting
Say that 3 times fast.
fighting the Barbary pirates. Fighting the Barbary pirates. Yes, I can't say that fast. Fighting the Barbary pirates are in much better shape. but they're still not equivalent to the best Navy in the world, the
Right.
Royal Navy. And this time, France isn't going to help us because they've got their own problems on the continent. Plus, they're not real happy with us because if you remember, they think we reneged on our deal, which we kind of did. I'm going to be honest there, and yeah, we reneged on our deal. We did a lawyer. We basically lawyered up. We go, technically, we had to deal with the King of France. He's not there. No deal. Okay, but we kind of did chip on our deal, right? And as I said, Jefferson and Madison, who's currently the president, had both been for a weak central government. Understandably, that's because they saw the central government as a thing of tyranny. And so as a result, when you have a weak central government, you're not able to finance stuff. And so going to war is something you can't just do at the spur of the moment because you don't have a way to pay for it. Plus, Congress left on top of it, as if it were bad enough. Congress walks out, so now we don't have that either. So let's look at a map so we can kind of place everything in context. All right. So we're basically going to have 3 areas of campaigns. Okay, in the north. There's going to be one more area. We're going to have the Canadian frontier. We're going to have the Chesapeake Bay region up toward Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And then we're going to have the Great Lakes. Now, I grew up in Chicago, so the Great Lakes to me are just these big, massive bodies of water where you see, you see shipping of grain or things like that. It's the idea of it being a war zone is kind of crazy. But it is. It's a major war zone in this conflict.
That's the same thing as the Chesapeake Bay, though.
Yeah, likewise. It's just pleasure boating, and in the old days it would people crabbing, crabs and stuff like that, oysters. But
especially when they were like, "There's a ship at the bottom of it." No, there's not. Yeah, the Monitor Merrimack. Duh. I was like, "You're lying."
Oh yeah. So 3 major areas of campaign. So we're going to go through this and talk a little bit about what happens. So again, Canada, Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay. Those are the 3 major areas. So we start to raise an army, and the first and most obvious place to attack is Canada because it's the only British territory near us.
And we wanted maple syrup.
And we wanted maple syrup and/or free land from our point of view. We launched 3 efforts, 3 separate efforts to invade, and they all failed. And again, as I've mentioned to you, my Canadian students back at the Command and General Staff College were always quick to tease the Americans about this. But let's see, what's our fight record? Oh, that's right, it's 3-0 for us, 0-3 for you guys.
I don't know.
It's true. It's true.
Canadians are very bloodthirsty when it comes to war. Did you hear about their actions in World War II?
Yeah.
I thought they were really nice.
They are generally really nice,
That's just
but
propaganda.
once you
Once you go to war,
once you get them riled up, they can get pretty upset.
But that's everybody.
Yeah, but they are generally considered very nice people, and I've never met a Canadian who wasn't a nice person.
It's because of them that there's a special little commendum in the Geneva Accords because of their war crimes.
Because since I'm from Michigan, there's a lot of rivalry and trash talk
Yep.
that people just randomly spout about Canada, like how they suck and everything about them is bad. And like they're worse at hockey, that sort of thing.
The more you talk, all I can keep hearing is them arguing in the back. Don't you know? Like,
Right.
go back.
So yeah, I mean, I think border states have a little more rivalry, whereas I was in Chicago, was far enough away from Canada. Believe it or not, I've never been to Canada. It's so kind of funny. I've been to Europe, I've been all kinds of other places, but I've never been to
Like
Canada.
if anyone,
Even though I lived,
if
10 hours
anyone
away.
claimed that they were from Canada, they would be mercilessly mocked by everyone.
So there you go. So again, our northern Canadian frontier, absolute failure, abject failure, no debate there. In 1814, the British decide they're going to seize and burn Washington, okay? Which they do successfully.
For a split second, but I thought you meant George Washington.
No.
Did they not burn
He's
him?
deceased. He died in 1799. He's been dead for 15 years at this point. But Washington, D.C., yes.
Isn't this when Dolly Madison takes the portrait of George Washington?
Right. Dolly Madison is, her husband is out kind of reviewing the troops. She's back at the White House. They get word there was literally a column marching up the road toward Washington. And so they're trying to, they load up a wagon with everything they can. And the famous picture of George Washington that becomes the basis for the dollar bill image of Washington is screwed into the wall. It's not hung, it's literally screwed into the wall. And so what happens is she eventually just gets one of the servants to get a knife and to cut it out of the frame. That's how eventually she gets it out. By the way, the table had already been set at the Washington for a dinner, so the British officers go ahead and enjoy the dinner and then set fire to the building afterward. And you can find images. There was a painting that was done right after the burning, and there's a painting out there that was done. And you can see it's the White House. You can see the outline of the main building. There's no west wing, east wing yet. That hasn't been built yet. It's just the rectangle in the middle. And just by all the windows, there's just chars, charred flame chars from where the smoke came out. The entire center of the building was gutted, and just the four walls were standing. When the White House was extensively remodeled in the late 1940s, because it was on the verge of collapse, because of some bad engineering that had happened over the next 150 years, they came upon a part where the charring was still visible. And President Truman ordered them not to paint over it.
I saw that in the documentary on CBS.
Yeah, it's like plexiglass, it's covered in plexiglass. And Truman ordered it not to be covered because he says he wanted it there to remind Americans what poor national defense could result in. And
You know what's happening again, January 6th?
Yeah, well,
Just kidding.
so they burned the White House. Thankfully, they don't burn the Capitol. And I can't remember what happened, why they didn't burn the Capitol, but they were intending to burn the Capitol too. Capitol wasn't finished. By the way, they don't finish building the Capitol until during the Civil War. So like there's no dome on the Capitol. It's just like where the dome would be, it's just like a cut off there. I've seen pictures and it's really weird looking. You're looking and going, that's not the Capitol. But yeah, they were still in the business basis of building it. They then turn and try and take Baltimore, which is the bitter prize, because let's be honest, Washington, D.C. until after World War II is not very big, and it's kind of a ghost town much of the year, especially the summer, because it was basically a giant swamp. And you can see pictures of Washington, D.C. as late as the 1920s, where there are sheep grazing where the mall is. You know where the reflecting pond and all that is? There are literally sheep grazing there. You can look it up, Google it. It's there. From the 1920s, they have sheep grazing. That's how late, because the place was nothing. Baltimore, however, is one of America's major cities at that time. And so the effort is then made to take Baltimore, but thankfully Fort McHenry, which was part of that system of fortifications that Jefferson had been about beefing up, okay, withstands the bombardment and repels the British. And so they are not able to capture Baltimore. What's significant about this? Well, in the Star-Spangled Banner. The Star-Spangled Banner is written after the bombardment of Fort McHenry. The rockets, red glare, bombs bursting in air, and he was referring to the flag inside Fort McHenry that was flying the whole time. And so, there you go. That's where that all comes from. So Francis Scott Key is literally in a hotel in Baltimore, and he can see this happening, and he composes the Star-Spangled Banner that night and into the next morning.
Did you compose the melody too?
I think the melody was pre-existing, because for a lot of those songs, like
They would adopt old tavern
yeah,
songs.
like tavern songs and
Words.
stuff. Yeah, because the tune was already popular among people.
Like
There-
she shanties.
Yeah,
Yes.
And then,
Yeah, like macaroni is like a feather or something.
Yeah. Yeah, like God Save the King, or God Save the Queen, because it's Queen now, the British anthem, we use that for one of our songs. I can never remember which one's which, so. I never learned how to read music, so I'm terrible about that sort of stuff. So, that's the kind of the northern front and the Chesapeake Bay front, all right? What about up in the Great Lakes region and other parts? Well, coinciding with this, there is a Native American leader named Tecumseh who manages to be, for the only time that we know of, Tecumseh manages to unite a bunch of different Indian tribes together against the United States. And this is one of the principal reasons that, in general, the Native Americans fail when they go to war with us, is not just because of technology or other things, it's their lack of unity. In almost all other cases, they are one tribe fighting against the Americans. Tecumseh is such a charismatic figure that he manages to convince all these disparate tribes, who many of them don't like each other, that, hey, you don't like me, I get that, but the bigger threat is the Americans. And see, this is the problem for them is they may have had a grudge against that other tribe for 400 years. The Americans have been around from their perspective for like 50. So who would I rather attack? I'd rather attack those guys I've hated for 400 years rather than these guys I've hated for 50. Not acknowledging that the bigger threat is the younger guys, not your old enemy, okay? But Tecumseh manages to get them together, to unite them. And so, the United States response is to send a commander named William Henry Harrison. And Harrison is a rare, decent general for that time. Most of our generals are not that great in this early era. He manages to get the Native Americans to attack him so that he's on the defensive. And from a military standpoint, you always want the enemy to attack you when you've already prepared your positions, okay? If you're dug in and prepared, when the enemy attacks you, even if they have superior numbers, you can often defeat them. So Harrison's smart, unlike a lot of these other commanders at this time. And he goads them into attacking him. The result is the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is an absolute disaster for the Native Americans. And also, correspondingly, it ruins their efforts at unity. Because when they lose, and they lose big, the reaction of all the Native Americans is, Tecumseh, this is your fault. If we hadn't listened to you, this wouldn't have happened. And in fairness, Tecumseh was more right than wrong. I mean, maybe he picked the wrong place at this particular battle, but his overall theme was correct from their point of view, for their purposes. But that's how that happened. So this is the one brief moment in time where the Native Americans had any unity and had any chance of getting victory over the United States. Please.
Is it's called the
I can't remember.
I know how to spell it,
Iroquois
but I don't know how to
Confederation.
say it.
Well, yeah, the
It's
Iroquois.
like 5 or 6 tribes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the Iroquois, by this point, I think many of the Iroquois were already kind of had made deals with the individual states. Because a lot of them are like upstate New York. There's reservations up in upstate New York. So I don't know which tribes were exactly involved in this deal that they made. But again, it was, like I say, it was the one shot. The Iroquois Confederation was pretty powerful in New England and New York State, but I'm not sure how much they were involved and how much more of the Midwestern tribes, when you get into Indiana, Ohio, because the Battle of Tippecanoe takes place in Ohio.
So this
So-
never had like an official name?
They may have, but I don't remember it off the top of my head, so I apologize. And this will, anybody know what will eventually happen to William Henry Harrison?
died after 30
He'll be
days.
president, yeah, he'll be president.
He died of being drunk or something.
No, he's the guy.
Pneumonia.
He's the guy who gives the speech in the rain.
Oh.
His inaugural speech he gives in the rain,
Without a
and it's
coat.
the longest inaugural address in recorded history, and he refuses to wear a hat or a raincoat. catches pneumonia, and he's dead in 30 days. 33, I think, to be
I
exact.
think there was like this rumor where he kept frequenting brothels and he was drunk or something.
That,
I don't know.
that may have also been going on. I'm not sure about that. But his cause of death is bronchial pneumonia, based on getting soaked for like 3 hours in the rain. I don't even know how you give a speech for 3 hours at all, let alone how you give a speech for 3 hours and you're in the rain. Wouldn't your notes have bled and you like, I can't read this? And
It's all up
And
here.
he was even a journalist who said what the speech was gonna that good.
yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
So,
John
yes.
Tyler to this place.
yeah. So anyway, so that's that. So let's now shift south. Okay, let's now shift south. We have, again, Native Americans up here in what will eventually be, this is Alabama, this is Mississippi, but it's still all called the Mississippi Territory. They're not states yet. They haven't been divided into different states. So we'll have Native Americans here, and then we'll have the Battle of New Orleans, which is going to be the kind of culminative point of this conflict. So in the Southern Theater, we have Andrew Jackson as leader. Okay, Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Jackson's not a nice man. Quite frankly, you can be a good leader and a jerk. You could be a bad leader and a nice guy, or you could actually be a good leader and a nice guy, or a jerk and a terrible leader, right? So you can mix and match. And when you're honest about presidents, you gotta say that there are some. Jimmy Carter was a wonderfully good man. He was a terrible president, okay? I'm picking somebody a little further back so I don't roar up flames from more recent presidents, okay? But Jimmy Carter was a wonderful man, morally a good man, terrible president, okay? Richard Nixon was both a terrible person and a terrible president, in my personal opinion. Personal opinion, that's all it is.
I
okay?
mean, some really interesting stories about Jackson.
Yes, and so Jackson is a halfway decent president. I wouldn't, maybe a B minus. I'm a teacher, everything's based on grades. But maybe a B minus as a president. As a human being, he's an F. The only redeemable quality I can find of Andrew Jackson is that he intensely loved his wife and was loyal to her. That's it. I cannot find another redeeming quality of this man on a personal level.
Maybe about why he was subject of a first assassination attempt on a sitting president.
Okay, but that doesn't necessarily get him points. You know what I'm saying? That he's tough. This guy was in like half a dozen duels. He had a lead ball sitting in his chest next to his heart for like the last 30 years of his life because someone had shot him in a duel, and the doctor's like, I'm not going anywhere near that. It's too deep, and I'll kill you if I do it. So he's walking around with a lead ball in his chest. He's a tough guy. There's no debate that. I mean, this guy is hard. The reason they call him Old Hickory. Hickory is a really hard wood. Okay.
He also had a stick that made of hickory that he beat people with.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Also, speaking of that's an assassination attempt, apparently Vadai pulled both triggers on the bullets. They both misfired.
Misfired. Yeah.
But when they were inspected, nothing was wrong with
Nothing
them.
wrong with them. Yeah. No, that happened to him too. Somebody tried to assassinate him, and both pistols misfired, and they couldn't figure out why. So the guy led a charmed life in that sense. But he is. I'm going to use a word I don't like to use because it has been so watered down it doesn't mean anything anymore. The man's a racist. And you might say, okay, great, you're being a pinko liberal and everybody's a racist. No. This guy, at the time, was considered a racist. Okay? It's the 1820s when he's president. You can own other human beings. People look at Jackson and go, Jackson's kind of a racist. Okay? Think of how high that standard is. You can own other human beings. And guys who own other human beings are going, man, Jackson is kind of a racist.
Why?
He hated everyone. That's probably the nicest way I could put it. But he really hates Indians
Oh.
and African Americans. He really does not like either group. Indians are the ones he hates the most, except for the English, which is ironic, considering some English stock. He absolutely hates the English. He was a little boy, I'll get to you in a second. He was a little boy during the American Revolution. And there was a British garrison in his town. And the British officer grabs him off the street and tells him, polish my boots. And he refuses to do it, and the guy beats him until he's unconscious. And so Jackson then, for the rest of his life, hates the English too. So he really is an equal opportunity racist. He hates every race, including the English, which he is ethnically. But yeah, he liked his wife, and that's kind of the only person I think he ever liked. I'm sorry.
No worries. For me, it's just so funny because he adopts an Indian son because he likes to say, he's like, I don't hate Indians. I only hate Indians who don't assimilate.
But then you have the Trail of Tears,
Yeah.
which is the bunch that assimilated, and he still screws them over.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm sorry, he's just a contemptible human being at a human being level.
When Jackson left office, he said, I only have 2 regrets. I didn't shoot Henry Clay, I didn't hang John C. Calhoun.
Yeah. This is not a likable man in any
What did they do to him?
They're just political rivals, nothing personal. Well, kind of in the one case.
I love that he trashed the White House. And then did he have that big block of cheese too?
Yes. Yeah, the White House, basically imagine January 6th, but it's the White House, and instead of breaking in, they're having a party. So at his inauguration, we're off track here, but it's a good story. At his inauguration, because he's this man of the people, that's his whole rep. Every president's got their shtick, what's their deal? I'm the first president, Jackson, I'm the first president who's a man of the people. I was born poor, I worked my way up, et cetera, et cetera. All these presidents before me all have been rich Virginians and New Englanders. I worked my way up, and arguably this is a true fact. This is not just BS. So to show he's a man of the people, as soon as he finishes his inaugural address, he goes, come on to the White House, everybody, we're having a party. And after he goes to the White House, and somebody had donated this giant wheel of cheese that was like 4 feet in 4 feet in diameter. And people are like taking handfuls of cheese and just stomping through the White House, eating cheese,
Dripping cheese.
smearing it on the walls. The White House is unlivable for like 2 months after the party. It has been so badly trashed. They have to throw out most of the carpet, redo the walls, throw out the drapes. They just completely trash the entire White House. And he can't live there for a month or 2 months while they fix it, okay? And that actually happened.
The one in DC?
Yeah, the White House. The White House, the president's house. They actually trashed the White House.
Yeah, that's not the first one. There's like 15 of them.
Yeah, the outside walls were all the same, but we've rebuilt it a bunch of times. Yes, yeah, they just trash it. You look that up. That happened. But I'm not saying that's why I don't think he's a nice person. I'm saying that for other reasons. But anyway, so in this case, he's fighting the Indians again, who he hates, and he fights the Red Stick Creek, which is a branch of the Creek tribe. Because again, this is one of those things we don't understand, but when we say the Creek or the Sioux or the whatever, there's not just the Sioux. It's not like being, all right, here's the analogy. Let me find a good analogy here. British, saying somebody's British. Well, are you Welsh, English, Scottish, or Irish? Because those are the British Isles. There's 4 ethnic groups. So when we say the Creek or the Sioux, it's like saying British. Well, yeah, technically, if you're from the Isles, you're from the British Isles. But no, I'm ethnically Welsh. I'm ethnically Scottish. So that's how the Indians think of themselves. I'm a Red Stick Creek. I'm not just a creek. I'm a Red Stick Creek. And there's Oglala Sioux, which is, yes, I'm a member of the Sioux Nation, but I'm an Oglala Sioux. So it's not the same thing as being just, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not just a Sioux. Just like I'm not just British, I'm actually Scottish, but I'm from the British Isles, from the United Kingdom. Okay? So he fights out with the Red Stick Creek. He catches them at what becomes called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and he's able to beat them so decisively that that's it. It ends their power base in Alabama and Georgia. They're out.
For that analogy, could you just use America as an analogy? Well, I'm American, or Canadian, North American, Mexico.
Well, yeah, but I think for the most part, even in like Latin America, and you guys who have experience with Latin America can tell me otherwise, but I think even in Latin America, when they say American, they do mean us, right? Does anybody know who's
Yes,
traveled
yes.
to Latin America? Please.
Yeah, like America just means German. It's different when it's American and when it's Europe or
Yeah.
South America because there's conflict. They generally have conflict with each group.
Right.
With the Americas, sure we hate each state, but
Yeah.
it isn't like a deep hatred.
Yeah.
It's like being from Texas. You can't say you're from Texas because everybody's like, oh yeah, where are you from? Oh, we're not from. That's not really Texas. Like
Right.
Brownsville. They'll be like, oh, that's not really Texas.
Or El Paso.
Yeah, that's not really. You know what I mean? So it's just like which part? Like you're not a true Texaner unless you live here, here, and here.
Well, evidently, true Texans are West Texas. That's
Right,
what
right.
I was.
Because they're like it's not even considered the South.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, you remember the old ad campaign Texas used to have? Texas were a whole other country. I really think that's kind of true because Texas, it's not the South, it's not the West, definitely not the North. It's Texas. It's its own special thing. So, I don't know. Anyway, so that's a major thing. Now let's go to C, and then we'll come back to end the war. Okay. Let's talk about what's going on to sea. The U.S. Navy had, at the beginning of the war, no ships of the line, meaning whatever the best style of ship in the world is. So later on, that'll be the battleship and later aircraft carriers. We had none of those big ships when the war began. Okay. Our entire Navy is 8 frigates, 14 sloops and brigs, and then a bunch of smaller coastal vessels. Which is impressive that we managed to pull off what we pulled off with the Barbary pirates with a navy that was, compared to the rest of the world, so tiny. So the British adopt a strategy which is very logical. We're just going to blockade all the American ports and we'll starve the Americans out. We'll just blockade all their ports, starve them out. They won't be able to trade. That's where all their money comes from. So we'll crush them that way. The American Navy, their strategy is to engage in hit and run tactics. The U.S. Navy cannot form, now they'll build a bunch of ships during the war. I don't want you to get the impression that that's the only ships we have for the whole war. They will build a bunch of ships. But we never have enough ships to go out and form a battle group and challenge the British. We have a few ships that are good enough for combat, and we tell those guys, get out there, attack the British wherever and whenever you can, but don't get yourself killed. So pick the weak targets. Hit and run. You see a target, you hit it, you get the heck out of there. Okay? Do not engage in a full-on gun-to-gun, blast-it-out kind of battle. Don't be stupid.
Guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, if there's such a thing as guerrilla warfare at sea, exactly. That's what they're saying. Be a guerrilla warfare at sea, okay? We have a few successes in individual ship-to-ship battles, and those are great for morale, and those are the ones you've probably heard of, but in the larger context of the war, they are worthless. They mean nothing in the larger context of the war, okay? They really don't. The U.S. Navy will capture about 200 plus merchant ships. American privateers will capture 1,300. What are privateers? Let's stop. What are privateers?
Like mercenaries?
Kind of like mercenaries. This is a thing, it's in the Constitution, look it up. The president has the power to grant letters of marque and reprise, it's called. That's in the Constitution. What this is, and the British would do this too, even though they had the best navy in the world. In those days, building a ship and all that and keeping it in commission all the time was so expensive that what they would do is they would go to the merchant shipping companies and they would say, do you have any ships that you could convert for warfare purposes? And when the shipbuilders build ships, they took that into consideration. So they put in the right things you needed so that in wartime, we can bring some cannons on board, and boom, we got a warship. The rest of the time, it's a cargo vessel. And so what happens is, as soon as the war breaks out, the president, through the U.S. Navy, says, anybody want a letter of marque and reprise, which is a legal document that means if you fight the British and you get captured, you're not pirates. You are auxiliary vessels of the United States Navy. And so that's why there's 1,300 British ships captured by privateers, but only 200 by the Navy. Why? There were more privateers.
So that's how we got all these auxiliary ships.
That's where that whole the USNS ships,
Yeah.
that's where that comes from. That's where that whole thing comes from. So we have it in the Constitution. Now, we've not used them as warships.
They're just refuelers.
Yeah, mostly
Yeah, they
refuelers,
bring
cargo
us- yeah, they
vessels,
bring
stuff
us,
like that.
Fuel and cargo and stuff.
You could make an argument that in World War II, we had sort of a system like a miniature version like this. They had deck guns on some cargo
I was
vessels.
gonna say, I don't, yeah.
Yeah, on some cargo vessels, they had deck guns. And these were armed, the deck guns were run by members of the actual US Navy on board the civilian-owned ships. And I'm assuming that they used that provision of letter of marque and reprise so that legally there was no problem internationally.
That doesn't sound ethical. It's arming civilian vehicles with weapons and send them to war.
I'm with you, but the British did the same thing, by the way. The British did the same thing.
With Dunkirk, right? With Dunkirk and with the.
Well, that wasn't like.
Dunkirk is a little different because
That's a rescue operation.
Yeah.
They were volunteer,
Yeah, that was a totally voluntary thing. Yeah, and they weren't trying to shoot at anybody. That's the key difference.
It's a rescue operation.
Yeah. They're just trying to get the people off. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, all by themselves capture about 1,400 American ships. Now you might say, well, 200, 1,300, 1,500. Hey, we won. 1,500 versus 1,400, we won. Well, remember how small we are, relatively speaking, at this time, population-wise. Remember how big the British Empire is at this time. We lost. Because we captured 100 more ships than they captured of ours, but we had way fewer ships than their entire empire did. So you could argue we lost the war at sea, but I will say this, we did pretty dang good considering where we started and how small we are and how small our budgets were. I think we put up a credible fight, a better than credible fight. In fact, I would argue at sea, if you're going to give people grades, I'm not going to give them a specific grade, but I will say this, the Navy gets a higher grade than the Army does. They do a much better job, the Navy and its auxiliaries, do a much better job with what they've got than the Army does on land.
We'll give them a battle E.
Yeah. So, again, I think they deserve credit. They did a good job and they deserve credit. All right, now, almost as soon as this war began, people in the United States and people in England are trying to end it because both sides realize this is really stupid. The British don't need another enemy. They're dealing with France and all France's allies on the continent. And the United States is woefully unprepared, as we've talked about. Okay? Napoleon still controls the Europe. And why should England fight a war, waste troops on the other side of the ocean for a not real purpose? Now, we have an invasion attempt from Canada. In addition to the ones into Canada, there's an invasion attempt from Canada. And this happens on Lake Champlain, where we have a flotilla of British ships, British and American ships that engage each other, and we managed to win there. Again, it's just weird to think of the Great Lakes as having a naval battle. And these ships on the Great Lakes they're not like ocean-going vessels.
So those monsoons and short boats.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. It's not very impressive. They found one, it was amazing, because the Great Lakes are so cold that if you get down to the bottom, there's almost no decay or animals that are going to eat the wood and stuff. So they recovered, this is about 20 years ago, they recovered one of the gunboats used during the Battle of Lake Champlain. It's sitting on the bottom of the lake in like perfect condition. So they raise it and they do all that stuff they have to do where they pump in the chemicals to prevent the wood from rotting. And it looks like a giant rowboat. I mean, it's really like, holy crud, you're telling me this went into battle? Yeah, I mean, again, look it up. I think the Smithsonian has it. I might be wrong.
I like to imagine a bunch of guys row into battle and the generals on the stern with a sword out.
Yeah, that painting, that famous painting. And so it had a what's the pole that holds the sails?
Mast?
What's that called? Mast. Thank you. Thanks. Sorry, I'm an army guy. It does have a mast, but it looks like a giant rowboat. I mean, it really does. And you could see they had like what was called a swivel cannon. You know, this cannon that fired a round that was only about this big on the front. And so some of these battles, we think of like World War II, or if we've seen enough movies like Master and Commander or something like that. These are smaller battles. Okay. It's in the Smithsonian. Okay, good. Yeah. So, and can you see an image of it, or no? If you do, let me know if it looks like a giant rowboat, because that's what my memory says. But I'm getting to the point where I'm wondering sometimes if I just imagine it. Now, the Battle of New Orleans will be the final battle of the War of 1812. Here's the thing, though. The Battle of New Orleans never needed to happen. Why? When the failure on Lake Champlain got to the British said, that's it, we're out. Just cut a deal with the Americans. We got other fish to fry, right? So they signed the treaty on Christmas Eve, 1814. But it takes months for word to get from England to the United States. And in the interim, a third invasion is planned. The first being Chesapeake Bay, second being Canada. Third invasion is planned at New Orleans.
Is that a battle where, I think, wasn't Jackson said, don't fire until see the whites of your eyes?
Actually, that was Bunker Hill in the Revolution.
Okay.
What Jackson does is Jackson assembles this motley crew, and which includes, much to everyone's shock, Native Americans. Native Americans, and I mean, this shows you how desperate Jackson is. This is his army. Some American soldiers, some American militia, Native Americans who for some reason decided to side with us. Why? I have no clue.
They hate British more.
I guess. Pirates, honest to God pirates, the Lafitte brothers, who are French pirates in the Caribbean. We're not talking about Disney. We're honest to God French pirates.
Like
Okay.
Jack Sparrow.
Yeah. And free African Americans from the city of New Orleans. New Orleans had the largest percentage of free African Americans prior to the Civil War. So think about this army that Jackson's got. He hates all of them because he hates everybody, but he specifically hates 3/5 of his army, 60% of his army he hates, okay? But he's desperate, and he uses them. And they fight a battle in New Orleans. Now, the way they win is one of these freak things of history. Everyone's been to New Orleans, right? Everyone knows what New Orleans is like.
Actually, perfect.
Well, okay. I wasn't thinking specifically that part of New Orleans. I wasn't thinking the pub crawl part.
Oh, okay.
But they can't dig in. So you can't build your defensive positions by digging in and making a pile in front, like you normally dig in, because 3 inches down, there's water. Okay, what do? The warehouses in New Orleans, because remember, people would ship things down the Mississippi River, and then it would be picked up at the port of New Orleans and shipped off. Well, there's tons of stuff sitting in warehouses that nobody's been able to get rid of because the British have been having a blockade. There's bales of cotton, humongous amounts of cotton. So they build a fortress out of cotton bales. This sounds like a joke, but it's not. They stack the cotton up, and it probably looked like a little kid, stacking like wooden blocks up. But it's perfect because if you're talking bales like this thick, like a yard thick, that'll stop a bullet. A bullet from the weapons of this year, that would probably stop honestly, I think that would stop a modern
Right.
bullet.
RPG.
But let alone a 54 caliber slow moving round ball. So they build this fortification and they set it up where the British have to come at them through an area that's swampy. So the British are up to their knees in water trying to trudge across this field. The Americans are behind this goofy looking cotton bale thing, shooting at them as they come. And the British, I forget the casualty rate, the casualty ratios, even though the British outnumbered them 2 to 1, the British suffer something like 1,000 casualties and we suffer something like 5.
Honestly, it sounds like it'd be pretty good for shrapnel at least.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or artillery. So it winds up being this he has this crazy army that shouldn't have worked, but it worked because everybody was desperate. The ground shouldn't have worked. None of this should have worked, but it worked. But here's the thing, none of it mattered. The war was already over. So everybody remembers the heroic victory at New Orleans, and again, people who forget their history, which is 90-something% of Americans, think, and that's how we won the War of 1812. No, the war was over for like 3 months, guys.
Some messages got lost.
2,000 British?
There you go. I couldn't remember the exact number. 2,000 Brits. Did it say how many American casualties?
62.
62.
Wow.
So, that's it. The war is over. But our sense of national stupidity is not over. Oh, no.
More Americans died.
No. Something called the Hartford Convention has happened. Disgruntled Federalists. Remember the Federalist Party? That nationally, they're no longer a factor, but they were still a factor in New England. Okay? Remember John Adams kind of sank them with the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? Okay. So a bunch of disgruntled Federalists meet in Hartford, Connecticut, and set up the Hartford Convention, proposing that if their demands are not met, this list of demands they have, New England is going to secede from the Union. And what's their demands? End this war because it's destroying our shipping. Wait a minute, doofus. Aren't you the guy who voted for this war? Because all the southern states said, this is stupid, why are you doing this? So the same people that voted to get into the war now want out of the war, demand, not to ask, demand that Madison end the war, and if they don't do that and a bunch of other things we're angry about, we're leaving the Union. We're going to secede. Okay? So they send their demands to Washington, and they arrive at almost the exact same time that the news of the victory of New Orleans reaches Washington. And this is the final blow to the Federalist Party. This is the death of the Federalist Party because they have totally shown themselves to be buffoons and idiots. They were the reason we got into this war, not the Democratic Republicans, which again, remember, is that confusing other party. The one that's both of our parties, but somehow it's one party. Okay? The DRs had said, no, there's no reason to go to war. The Federalists are, no, we got to go to war to protect shipping. And then they find out their shipping suffers even more during the war than it did before the war. Then they demand we get out. And they just completely look like jerks. I don't know how else to put it. And that's it. The Federalist Party is done after this. Almost nobody will associate with the Federalist Party. And any chance they had of making a comeback after their embarrassing Alien and Sedition Acts. And eventually the next party we're going to get is the Whigs, but that's a few years away. So there will be another party invented, created, whatever you want to call it, but that's going to be a few years away. So how do we wrap up this whole era? Well, The War of 1812 is sometimes considered the second war of American independence. We're able to stand against the largest army in the world again. We won. Notice I'm putting air quotes around won, because I gotta be honest, this goes like Korea in my box. This is a tie. You know, wins, losses, ties. I'm sorry, I'm putting that in the tie box just like I put Korea.
At least we got Alan out of it.
There's that. We got MASH out of Korea. One of the key things that's positive, though, that comes out of this is this begins what's called the first industrial revolution. Now, don't think industrial revolution like giant factories churning out stuff. No. But what I mean by this is we have to start looking inward for manufactured goods that we have previously simply imported from Britain and Europe. And this starts the cottage industry phase of the Industrial Revolution. So if you remember back to your 1305, I guess it would be, the first wave, I am quote unquote the factory owner. The factory is the size of this room. You work for me, and let's say it's the garment industry. Okay, it's the garment industry. I buy huge bolts of cloth. I pre-cut. I have one person who stays in the factory, and that person pre-cuts the cloth into sizes. You come in, you get 10, 20, however many pieces, you take them home, you sit there with a needle and thread, you sew the clothing, then you bring it back, and when you bring back the finished pieces, I pay you for your work. Okay, it's that early cottage industry phase of the Industrial Revolution. And we start that during the War of 1812 because we can't get stuff otherwise. And the garment industry is not the only industry. Obviously, all industries are affected. Okay.
It's not an industrial revolution without child workers.
Yeah, we don't have that. Yeah, we don't have child workers getting their fingers cut off in bobbin machines. Yeah, that's later. We've got that delightful part to look forward to later. But this is the one positive that comes out of the War of 1812. It forces us to start thinking about these things, like how are we going to be ready for the next war? Well, we can't rely on anybody else to make our stuff for us. We've got to make our stuff for us. There's going to be a couple other positives that come out of it, more military-oriented. We'll talk about that in our next session, which we're going to begin right away. We're not going to stop because we lost the whole day. So, let us talk then about the period after. Give it one more shot. I'm really wishing I had my phone with me so I could take a picture of screenshot to show them. I tried to do what you told me to do and it didn't work. Anyway, so this era between the end of War of 1812 and the Civil War, okay? So this is the era in which the armed forces become professional. They become professional services, I would argue. We lose the amateurism. So let's start with some demographics. All right, in 1770, the last census before the American Revolution, there's a whopping total of 2.2 million people living in what becomes the United States. By 1790, that number is 3.9 million. By 1850, it's 23 million. So we're going to see an enormous jump in a period of 60 years here. How many people? Why? Immigration. That's what this is all going to be about. This is a kind of neat breakdown I was able to find. So of that 3.9 million, this is again in 1790, 3.2 are rural. They're farmers. By the way, the majority, 50% of the American people are still involved in agriculture, farming, something along those lines, as late as 1929. It is only the Great Depression that will fundamentally change agriculture in America into what it is today, where almost none of us have anything to do with agriculture. And only if you have like family that lives in the country do you even seen it and know what it is, okay? We are so removed today. You can see very tiny percentage, less than 1 million people are urban. The gross national product is 1.1 billion, and the per capita GNP is $293. That's not bad. I know it sounds horrible. That is not a bad sum for the era we're talking about. So 1790. By the time we get to 1850, we still have a very large percentage that's rural, but again, I can't do this math in my head because I'm a historian, but the percentage has gotten bigger. The urban percentage has gotten bigger relative to the whole total, okay? Gross national product has gone up, and the per capita has gone up. Inflation, by the way, in this era is extremely low. We're right now facing a historic rate of inflation. We're over 10%. We haven't experienced that since the late 70s, early 80s. In this era, you're talking 1% a year, maybe sometimes not even 1% a year inflation. It's really low. I can't explain that. I think I have a buddy who's an economist, and the way he tried to explain it to me is people aren't playing with the money supply in this era. They're all farmers. They grow grain, they sell grain. Nobody, there aren't banks manipulating things and currency exchange, and he says that inflation tends to be more based on he believes more manipulation of the money supply and things like that, like loans and stuff. People don't take loans in this era very much. They don't.
That's before then. This is just all on a promissory note or just on
Yeah.
the word, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that was his way of trying to explain it to me. Okay. So we have grown from right before the revolution. We grow a little bit in the 20 years after that. We grow enormously in the 60 years post that. Territorially, we have grown massively. We had in 1790 roughly 888,000 square miles. That was the United States. Again, this was the United States up to the Mississippi, but we didn't have Florida. Remember, we still didn't have Florida. By 1850, we haven't done the Gadsden Purchase yet. We haven't done Hawaii yet. We haven't done Alaska yet. So, and the Gadsden Purchase is a tiny sliver of land in Arizona and New Mexico. I'll show you a map that shows that later. Okay. What's that?
15
Yeah. So this is most of the contiguous 48 states. This is most of it. Okay. And you can see that the square miles per person. Okay. So if you divided up all the land in 1850, that would be 1/10 of a square mile per person. Okay. And 1/10 of a square mile that's a good amount of land. I forget how many acres in a mile. My daughter is learning this kind of stuff right now. I don't know it. She got in trouble with my wife the other day because she couldn't remember like ounces in a pound and pints and quarts and all that.
I can teach you.
And I said, you know what? I got to think about that for a second because I'm not sure I remember all that.
Well, 16 ounces a pound.
Well, that one I remember, but like quarts and a gallon and pints and
4 quarts, quarters.
I know, I
You're
know,
talking
I
about
know.
four quarters equal a dollar. Come on now.
640,
I'm sorry?
640 acres.
640 acres in a mile, in a square mile?
In a square mile, yes.
Okay, so 1/10 of that would be 64 acres. So could you imagine if every American had 64 acres? That'd be pretty cool. I would enjoy that. And the number of states has obviously increased in this time. Oh, here's the map. Good, here's the map. So this shows we've got the original 13 colonies. We got the land we got at the end of the American Revolution. We've got Florida that we gained between 1819 and 1821. We've got the Louisiana Purchase, okay? We've got, of course, Texas. We'll talk more about that later. That's from the Texas secession. Oregon Territory, there had been a dispute whether that was part of the Louisiana Purchase or did it belong to the British. We finally cut the final deal with them in 1846. And then the last sliver we're going to get is the Gadsden Purchase, which is 1853. So that's after the Mexican War. I can't remember why we wanted it. I don't remember what the deal.
They couldn't make train tracks that could turn
Yep.
very well.
Oh,
So
okay.
they-
There you go. There you go.
Yep.
Thank you. I'd forgotten about that. That's
And
right.
it was the same
That's
thing
doing
for
trains.
Texas, at the top of Texas, the reason why it was that way. And in Virginia, it was almost, where Virginia and West Virginia split, it was the same way, like, that was almost Transylvania.
Speaking of transportation and trains, in 1800, how long would it take to go from Philadelphia or New York to the rest of the country? And this kind of charts it out. Okay, you could get from Philadelphia to New York in a day.
By train?
No trains yet. That would be by ship. okay? But the further away you go, especially inland, where you can't take a ship, the longer it takes. Because it's only 3 weeks to get to Florida, but 6 weeks to get to like the Chicago area or Indiana, because you have to go across land. Although you could theoretically take the Great Lakes, but they didn't all link up easily at that time. So again, transportation time is going to be key for the military, because if we've got to move troops, we've got to take water. And we tend to forget this because we're used to the idea of flying everywhere. Most of our stuff is moved by water. All the tchotchkes you buy at Walmart
Yeah.
or you buy on Amazon all came over on massive tanker ships. Okay? Look those things up. Look at some of those pictures. How many of those cargo containers they can fit on one of those suckers from China? Oh my gosh, it's insane.
So what's the game plan? Mexico invades Louisiana. They send troops down in 1 month.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, exactly. You can't, it would take forever. And so for the military, this becomes a real issue. You have to move things by sea, and if you can't move things by sea, you're gonna have a problem. We have to quit for now, but railroads are gonna be the initial solution to that problem. Okay? Railroads are gonna be the initial solution to that problem. So when we meet again, we'll pick up on here and I'll elaborate a little more on railroads. And I'm sorry, unfortunately, that's our first and last class this week. So